Well, what are the roles of the Governor-General? The usual range: ceremonial, constitutional, community, and so on. I won't go into any detail about that, I don't think. If you can read the paper if you wish to know details. But I think it's worth concentrating on the constitutional role. Though the Governor-General is the representative of the sovereign, most of their actual powers derive from acts of Parliament and regulations rather than the royal prerogative. They assent to bills and orders in council, open and dissolve Parliament, appoint ministers, and so on. Once seen as an instrument of imperial will, the Governor-General is occasionally now seen as a constitutional safeguard against executive despotism. However, arguments that the Governor-General can act as a guardian of the Constitution appear to grossly overstate the case. There have been significant changes in recent decades that the Governor-General has neither wished to intervene in nor been able to stop. Ultimately, of course, that's hardly surprising. We are a constitutional monarchy, not an autocratic monarchy. Like the sovereign, the Governor-General will almost always only act on the advice of ministers responsible to Parliament. The only real difficulty arises where the ministers may not actually have the support of Parliament. I'll cover briefly the Republican situation or argument in New Zealand. There is comparatively little tradition of republicanism in New Zealand. It has never been as strong as it is in Australia. Jim Bolger, National Party Prime Minister, in 1994 started the debate when he said that New Zealand should become a republic by the turn of the century. The reason he gave was that the tide of history is moving in one direction, towards republicanism as a fulfilment of national identity. Needless to say, because the National Party's first principle is loyalty to the Queen, he was not well received by his party, and only a few years later he effectively was deposed by the party leadership. And I have it from a good source that the primary reason that they got rid of him was because they feared that he might become the first president of New Zealand. And subsequently, whenever anyone has tried to suggest we should become a republic, it's very easy to shoot them down by saying, oh yes, we'll have Jim Bolger as president. Or Helen Clark, for that matter. And they always say, no, no, I think we're quite happy with the Queen, thank you very much. One of the arguments raised for New Zealand becoming a republic is that we're a South Pacific nation with a focus on Asia. Specifically, political arguments revolved around nationhood, what New Zealand stands for, and its feelings of self-respect. All very woolly, uncertain sort of arguments. More important among the symbolic arguments, and that upon which Mr. Bolger in particular relied, was that it was inappropriate for the Queen of England, as he described her in the speech in which he proposed republicanism, to be head of state, and yes, the term is used in New Zealand occasionally, and to have power to appoint a Governor-General to exercise her royal powers on her behalf in New Zealand. National identity, according to this argument, required a New Zealand head of state. Attacks upon the Crown have been motivated not because of criticism of the way in which the political system operates, but because of the connection with the British monarchy. The position of the Crown, however acceptable and useful a system of government may be, is potentially undermined by the very symbolism which is one of its strengths. This is the essence of the Australian, much of the Australian Republican movement. Yet this very aspect is of importance in New Zealand because of the Treaty of Waitangi. One of the successors to Jim Bolger, Prime Minister who was replaced relatively recently, was Helen Clark, who represented the other major political party in New Zealand, the Labour Party, which is much more inclined to republicanism. She herself, though declaring that a Republic of New Zealand was inevitable, was pragmatic enough to say that it wasn't something she wanted to push. Despite that, she did what she could behind the scenes, abolishing Queen's Council and knighthoods, for instance, but the present government has restored both, I might add. Me. The biggest problem for anyone proposing a republic in New Zealand, however, is the Maori population. Though they represent somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population, they are politically very significant. To the Maori population, or at least its political elite, the Crown, however that might be defined, was often seen as an ally against the colonial or later national government in Wellington. It's at least symbolically important that the Treaty of Waitangi was signed by Maori chiefs with the representative of the Queen, and not between Maori chiefs and the settler population or government. Whilst most criticism of the monarchy, and there's not a lot of it out there in New Zealand, focuses on what Republicans call the self-evident absurdity of sharing a head of state with another country, people seem to be more concerned with the effectiveness of the political system. Symbolism was all very well, but the system seems to work, and it's cheap. We don't have multiple government houses or governors. We've got, well, one Governor-General. There's actually two government houses, but the one in Auckland has only got 3 bedrooms. It's a small cottage. Relatively cheap. Relatively cheap. I was delighted 11 years ago now with the Australian referendum on the Republic, with some of the commentary, because it gave us, and I speak briefly as an advocate for retention of the monarchy, there was a lot of good ammunition in some of the literature. And my best quote, I think, was the politician who said, New Zealand should assert its independence and follow Australia's example and become a republic. When someone pointed out, well, Australia's not a republic yet, they're going through a referendum program, and they might not become one, they then said, oh, we don't want to be left behind either. We want to go ahead and become one now. Of course, the reality is New Zealand could have become a republic overnight if there had been the political will for that. But there isn't. The great majority of the population and the great majority of politicians would say, we're actually happy with the system as it stands, and furthermore, we don't want to upset the Maoris. Right? Too difficult. One of the reasons knighthoods were restored after a hiatus of 10 years, almost, was that there was a tradition that the Maori paramount chiefs received knighthoods. Now, they don't even call themselves paramount chiefs now. They usually call them kaumatua, or just a Maori, the chief, the leader of a tribe. They don't even use the term chief nowadays. But the reality is, if you look down the names of the knights with clearly Maori names, most of them, at least in the past, were actually paramount chiefs of the 16 tribal confederations. In New Zealand today, it can probably be said there's only a small, very small Republican movement, though opinion polls indicate a slightly higher level of support. I wouldn't even dignify this with the term debate or movement. Although it receives a reasonable degree of media attention at times, the movement can, with much accuracy, be said to depend upon the exertions of one man, the Republican movement's president. Now, that may seem very facetious for me to say that, but the reality is monarchy-republic debate is very, very low-key in New Zealand. What is more serious, however, and this is the point at which I want to conclude, is that even those who should be supporters of the system, such as the current Prime Minister, John Key, seem to believe that it is inevitable that New Zealand will one day become a republic. For me, nothing is inevitable. I used to say, well, you know, there's a saying that death and taxes are inevitable. I have now realised that neither of those are inevitable either. So certainly there's nothing inevitable about New Zealand becoming a republic. An illustration of where we're at in New Zealand today is that earlier this year a private member's bill was introduced into Parliament by a Green MP, Keith Locke, who on his maiden speech some 10 years ago said that he was entering Parliament because he wanted New Zealand to become a republic. At the time people laughed at him. It was just such an odd thing to say. People had no idea where he was coming from. But he was lucky earlier in the year. He was able to pull his bill out of the ballot, which is held from time to time for private members' bills, and Parliament debated a bill which would introduce a process leading to a referendum on what Locke's bill described as the head of state. He never used the term republic or monarchy in the bill, or at least in its heading. It was just a head of state. But what he was proposing was a referendum on how the head of state should be chosen. He offered no guidance as to what replacement he might have for the present system. And he was proposing a system which was based on the principle, which he expressed in words to a journalist, that if we pass the bill, we just need to trust him that everything will work well and we'll come up with a good replacement. It's even less certain than the Australian referendum, where at least they had a specific proposal on the table. Needless to say, though there was some debate on this bill, it didn't get past the first reading. And the leader of the opposition Labour Party, and his party includes a significant number of Republicans, specifically said to me that though they would be happy to see it go to the first reading so that there could be some debate, they didn't want it to proceed any further because for New Zealand, at this time, or indeed any time in the foreseeable future, the monarchy is not an issue. My final word is this. Our biggest threat in New Zealand is not republicanism. It's the success of the monarchy. A system which has worked successfully for 200 years is one which is very easily taken for granted. The level of ignorance, and this seems to be a common concern expressed today, the level of ignorance of our constitutional system is appalling, absolutely appalling. And anything that can be done to improve the level of public understanding is well worthwhile. Thank you.